Hello, and welcome to History Speaks. It is March once again, and so for History Speaks, that means women's history. Today is a subject that I've been wanting to research and talk about for some time, female physicians in St. Joseph and Buchanan County. This project began when I came across a list of early female physicians in Buchanan County. It was in the Northwest Missouri history. However, that's all it was, just a list, and many of the names were misspelled, and so it was a lot of intensive research, because as history goes, it's usually not the women that are heavily documented and talked about in written record. And so today I will share with you what I've learned about these amazing women. We will begin with Dr. Kate Louisa HICOX. She arrived in St. Joseph in 1889. She was born in Clayville, New York. Her parents were Cornelius J. Knickerbocker and Mary L. Luce. Dr. HICOX was educated at LaCroix Academy in New York, then on to Whitestown Seminary in Whitesboro, New York, then on to Clinton Liberal Institute, and then finally she attended Hahnemann Medical College in Chicago, where she graduated from in February of 1887. She practiced in Chicago until 1889. Upon establishing her practice here in St. Joseph, she applied her superior ability and prompt attention to the calls of suffering humanity, received a lucrative practice, and acquired many warm personal friends. By the time she arrived in St. Joseph, she was married to James HICOX. She had married him in New York in 1875, and together they had one daughter, Augusta. However, on November 18, 1890, Dr. HICOX filed for divorce from her husband, James. The petition in the newspaper stated that he was, among other things, a non-resident of the state of Missouri, and that he had offered such indignities as rendered her condition intolerable. In the spring of 1891, she advertised in the newspaper that she could remove facial blemishes and superfluous hair with the means of electricity. In October of 1892, she married Dr. Redford W. Fisk. Now, I couldn't find much on Dr. Fisk other than his father was also a doctor who went by the same name, and it appears our Dr. Fisk was in St. Joseph for a brief time. In December of 1900, her daughter Augusta married George Anderson, who was the head of transportation for Swift & Company. Now, I mentioned the wedding because it was worth mentioning. As the newspaper reported, the church was tastefully decorated by Kidd, and I was not able to find out who Kidd was, but it was just the one name. Pink chrysanthemums, palms, and smilax being used in artistic combination. The bride wore a stylish gown of dark blue trimmed in ivory with applique in Persian colors, vest of rose pink velvet covered with point Duchess lace, a large picture hat of black velvet. She was attended by her mother, Dr. Kate L. HICOX, who wore a handsome robe of black lace over crimson taffeta, evening bonnet of black velvet and cut jet. So this didn't seem like your usual wedding attire exactly. Augusta eventually moved away from St. Joseph with her husband, and Dr. HICOX continued her successful practice here. In the meantime, her second husband, Dr. Fisk, didn't die till 1907, but by the end of 1904, Dr. HICOX is married to a man named John P. Clary. And in 1911, Mr. Clary dies from late-stage syphilis. However, he and Dr. HICOX had been separated for 2 years, and coincidentally, Clary had suffered from the syphilis for 2 years before he died. And I'm not really sure in what order those particular events played out. But after Clary's death, his son Hugh filed a suit against Dr. HICOX, claiming that she had exerted undue influence over his father and caused him to deed to her $7,000 in cash and considerable real estate just before his death. And the research on Dr. HICOX was particularly difficult, I guess I would say, intensive. She kept her practice under her name of Dr. Kate HICOX. However, through her successive marriages in the newspapers, and I don't know if this is what she went by or just the newspapers, how they reported it, but she would go by her married name. So it was a bit of a challenge sometimes to make sure I was finding the right person. There were a couple of times where I thought maybe these are two separate women, because the last two husbands had also been married before. But I was able to track it down, and it was her that they were always talking about. Now, with this money that she received from her third husband, she did build a new house in town. Eventually, Dr. HICOX would move away to Oregon to live the rest of her life with her daughter. During the course of this research, there were a few doctors that I came across one or two things, but then it was really just ads in the paper for their practice. So there are several doctors that I want to mention, but I don't have as much research on them. One being Dr. Emily Sibley Colt. And I should say all of the women that I'm talking about today were very successful during their time in St. Joseph and very much appreciated by the community. One of these women being Dr. Emily Sibley Colt. She was born February 27th, 1839 in Rochester, New York. She arrived in St. Joseph somewhere in between the 1870s and 1880s. She came here because her husband, Judge Calvin Colt, was the county collector and deputy U.S. Marshal under Elijah Gates here. While researching her, she was attributed in later newspaper articles as the first female physician in Buchanan County. From what I found, that's not exactly true. She was very early, but it was likely she was not the first. It seems she didn't establish her practice in St. Joseph until the early 1880s. And from a very short bio on her, I had found that she had most likely become a doctor because her son was sickly. He ended up dying of scarlet fever in 1903. She continued her practice and wrote for medical journals. Dr. Harriet Jackson RAVOLD. She was born in 1867. Her parents were Dr. Henry Wissner and Dr. Sarah Wissner of Spring Brooks Ranch at Sharon, Kansas. Harriet graduated with honors from Hahnemann Medical College in Chicago, and she began practicing in Kansas City, and while there, she met Dr. Henry Jacques RAVOLD. They became very close friends, and that friendship blossomed into love. And on June 3rd, 1896, they married in a ceremony at Harriet's parents' farm. Now, Henry was the son of Dr. and Mrs. L.W. RAVOLD, and it turns out his younger sister, Louisa, would also go on to become a doctor. So it's a large family of doctors. The doctors RAVOLD established their practice here in St. Joseph, and it was very successful. It's interesting to note that doctors commonly ran ads in the newspaper, and that also makes researching a little bit difficult. If you're looking for newspaper articles about them, you have to sift through dozens and dozens of ads. Their advertisements were interesting. They had the same initials, so it was often Doctors H.J. RAVOLD. Though many times when their names were listed out, her name, Dr. Harriet Jackson RAVOLD, was always first. But I did notice only in the Catholic Tribune, when they ran the ad, his name would appear first. But it was only in that paper. All the other ones, her name was first. Unfortunately, Dr. Harriet RAVOLD died very young at the age of 38 in 1905. She had been ill for several years prior with cancer. But despite her illness, and there were articles that mentioned it sapping her strength, she continued to be active in women's clubs and to write extensively on medical subjects for various journals, though her vast knowledge was not limited solely to medical topics. Very shortly before her death, she presented a paper to the Runcie Club on the necessity of standardized plumbing for hygiene. As a result, the city of St. Joseph established the position of plumbing inspector. And as a side note, she would often be in parades in town, and she was known to have the fanciest carriage in town. It was sparkling white, it always said in the newspaper articles. Dr. Anna Holm Hurst, who was born in 1868 to James and Jemima Holm of Andrew County. In 1901, she graduated from the American School of Osteopathy in Kirksville, Missouri. There, one of her teachers was the founder of osteopathy, Dr. Andrew Taylor Still. She established her practice in St. Joseph, and her brother, Dr. Edward Dunville Holm, once he graduated medical school, he joined her in her practice, and they practiced together for several decades. Dr. Holm Hurst was married to Elijah G. Hurst, who was a grocer in town. His grocery store was on Sally and Mitchell Avenue, and he died in about 1911. She continued her practice here after he died, and when the Ballinger building was being designed, she was approached as one of its first tenants, and she accepted, and she was given the privilege of designing her office when the blueprints were drawn. She stayed in St. Joseph and practiced some 50 years before finally retiring in 1950. She passed away in 1952. Dr. Frania Chesbrough. She was born in December of 1870 in Madison, Ohio. When she was young, her family moved to Willoughby. During her last year at the Fredonia Normal School, she asked her parents for permission to become a nurse. They told her no, stating that she was too frail. Instead, she went on to teach school for a year, but at the end of that year, she came back and asked her parents once again to become a nurse, and reluctantly they agreed. She attended Ensworth Medical School here in St. Joseph and became its superintendent of nurses. And during that time, she was approached by several doctors and asked to supervise the hospital in Creston, Iowa. Initially, she refused them, but they finally got her to agree to, and so she went to Iowa. But during that time, she became frustrated with what she witnessed from male physicians. She lived by the Hippocratic Oath, and when she saw so many doctors forgetting or ignoring their sworn duty, this made her want to make a difference in the world. She re-entered medical college at Ensworth and graduated as a physician in 1899. After that, she joined her brother-in-law, Dr. W. John Bell, in his practice. But Bell had some health problems and often traveled because of that to different climates. And while he was gone, Chesbrough temporarily took over some of his patients. The female patients liked her so much that they stayed with her even after Bell returned. And eventually Bell would just remove from St. Joseph in favor of the climate in Egypt. And Chesbrough took over his practice. In 1907, St. Joseph lost Dr. Chesbrough as a doctor when she returned to Willoughby, Ohio, and established her practice in a large U-shaped white house that everyone came to know as Dr. Chesbrough's. Her residence was in one half and her practice in the other. Photos of babies that she helped bring into the world lined the walls of her waiting room. In a time when men often stayed out of the delivery room, Dr. Chesbrough required them to be present at the birth. She believed that this was necessary as it was a bonding experience for the parents and would instill upon the men the seriousness and importance of motherhood. During her 50 years of practice, she would be honored many times by her colleagues and community. She was so admired by her patients that many of the babies were named after her. She was still making house calls at the age of 80 when her doctors finally recommended that she should retire and rest. When she reflected on her career, she was quoted as follows, "Medicine has made many advances in the last 50 years. I'm glad to have served first as a nurse, then a hospital superintendent, and finally a doctor. I'd do it over again if I were a young lady." She passed away on July 6, 1957. Dr. Lida Hilliard. Lida was born January 26, 1869, along with her twin sister Ida. Lida originally went to school to become a music teacher. Piano and violin were her specialties. However, she knew that was not her life's calling. Though she loved music all throughout her life, she knew she did not want to teach it, though it was her means of supporting herself for the first few years of adulthood. In 1900, her family moved from Iowa to St. Joseph. She finally worked up the courage to inform her parents that she would be attending Ensworth Medical School. According to Dr. Hilliard, it created quite a stir within her family. Her family didn't fully approve of her pursuit until her fourth and final year of medical school, when she finally received her family's blessing on her occupation, and once she graduated, it became a point of much pride within her family. She graduated in 1905 and immediately established her practice here. In 1912, she ran for Buchanan County coroner. She may have been the first woman in the county to run for elected office. She ran on the Democratic ticket because "I believe the Democrats have the best chance to win," she said. For much of its early history, Democrats outnumbered Republicans in St. Joseph. Her campaign caused quite a stir within the city. The legality of a woman running for and holding office was the question everyone was asking when she filed. The city attorney was consulted, and nothing was found explicitly barring a woman from running. The verbiage was, I guess you could say, interesting. It only referred to the potential office holder as a he, and it was stated that the elected coroner was exempt from serving on juries, something women were not permitted to do at the time anyway. In the end, the only thing that could be found was a Supreme Court decision stating, "A woman is eligible to hold office if there is no constitutional or statutory provision expressly limiting the position to males." Women breaking the glass ceiling has a sometimes complicated history. Dr. Hilliard, despite her medical career and campaign for coroner, did not think women should vote, and she wanted to make it very clear to the public that she was not a suffragist. Another likely reason that she ran on the Democratic ticket. At that time, when the parties were different, the Republicans were the party of women's suffrage. When Dr. Hilliard was asked about suffrage, this was her response: "Not at least until they are educated in public matters. Women should be all right in public life if they knew enough to keep still and not interfere with everything. But if we were to have universal suffrage now, affairs of the state would be in a hopeless tangle for the next 5 or 10 years. After that, the fact that women had the ballot might be to the advantage of the country. But much education and bitter experiences would have to come first." Dr. Hilliard was up against 8 other men on the Democratic ticket and 1 on the Republican ticket. Though according to the papers, she was one of the front-runners in the coroner race, but she did not win. This didn't keep her from running again in 1916, however, but it still seemed Buchanan County was not ready for a woman to hold elected office. Dr. Hilliard maintained her practice in St. Joseph for almost 30 years, during which time her focus turned from general practice to the diseases of women and children. We know that Dr. Hilliard owned a car and was prone to speeding, as there were a couple of articles in the newspaper. And Dr. Hilliard was extremely devoted to her practice and her community, so much so that she worked long hours, which eventually took their toll. On August 31st, 1932, Dr. Hilliard passed away as a result of a stroke. She was 59. The papers reported that her funeral was the largest service ever conducted at Meyerhofer's Chapel. Finally, we come to the first female physician in Buchanan County in St. Joseph, Dr. Catherine Elizabeth Johnson VOSTEEN. She was born on July 26, 1823, in Germany. She had been betrothed to another young man in Germany, but he unexpectedly passed away, after which time she met and befriended Johann Heinrich von VOSTEEN. Von VOSTEEN intended to come to the United States. Catherine decided she also wanted to go to the United States. However, her mother told her that she would not be permitted to get on the boat unless she was married to VOSTEEN first. Reluctantly, she agreed, and they traveled by boat to the United States. Once they were here, Johann Heinrich became John Henry, the von was dropped, and they became the VOSTEENs. Eventually, they came to St. Joseph, as John was a stonemason and had heard that there was plenty of work in St. Joseph. Catherine had gone back to school and become a doctor. She established her practice here in 1870. She was very well liked and respected in the community, especially within the German community. She invented a chair for the purpose of making birthing easier, and it was very popular with her patients. Her relationship with her husband soured, and he actually left for St. Louis. One day while reading the newspaper in 1881, Dr. VOSTEEN saw that John had died, and it was desired, the newspaper said, that someone collect him and pay his debts. She did neither. As it happens, John VOSTEEN had been very busy while in St. Louis and started another family while still married to Dr. VOSTEEN. It was thought that one wife had found out about the other, and John decided the best course of action in this situation was to jump off a bridge. Dr. VOSTEEN continued to support her family through her practice. She passed away in 1913 and is buried in Mount Mora. There is a wonderful article about her written by her descendant, Sharon Kosick, in a Northwest Missouri Genealogical Society quarterly journal from 2013, which I will link down below. This presentation was maybe a bit more concise than I had originally intended. However, getting that far back into history and trying to glean details from women, some women who were married multiple times, changed names, and women's history being as it is, it was difficult to track down a lot of this research, and it took much longer than I had originally anticipated. However, many times my intention as my role as local history librarian is to spark a desire for our community to learn more about its past. So I wanted to share the details that I did have about these amazing women, because history can be added to. We find more and more out every day. And so this is something that I will probably continue to research. And if anybody happens to listen to this and it sparks a desire to learn more about these women, then that would be very exciting. Some other women that I did not get a chance to research, but were physicians and midwives in Buchanan County and St. Joseph, were Dr. Maud Enoch, who was a dentist here, Dr. Julia Hayward, Hattie Bartlett, Mary Picker, Anna Ezaplenska, Kate Jutton, Emma Harvey, Mrs. Frank Thompson, Mrs. Kay Reichla, Eliza Botchler, Mrs. Potts, M. Sacker, and Mrs. Turner. This list of names that hopefully someone will be able to research at some point was provided to me by our genealogy librarian at St. Joseph Public Library, Marina Trifan. Well, I want to thank all of you for sticking with me for this History Speaks. It was actually March's History Speaks last year. That was our last in-person one. So it feels kind of strange being a whole year out from that now. But we have many more interesting topics lined up for you this year, kind of centered around the Missouri Bicentennial. And watch out for more events around the Bicentennial, not just from the library, but other organizations in town as well. And there will be the Missouri Bicentennial from Steam to Steam Festival coming up in August. So watch for that. Thank you, everyone. We will see you next month.